In this session, I'd like to talk about the story of the resurrection of Jesus, found in the Gospel of Mark, Mark 16. It's probably the most primitive of the accounts, and that's typical of Mark's Gospel. Mark is very much the home videos. He presents things exactly as they occurred. And often when you're watching home videos, sometimes the camera is upright, sometimes on the side. That's Mark. He tells us exactly what happened. In Mark's Gospel, we hear that 3 women went to the tomb. Now it's interesting, each of the Gospels has a different number of women. In Mark, it's 3. In Matthew, it's 2. In John, it's 1. And in Luke, it's the whole lady sodality. In Mark, it's 3 because that's how many went. In Matthew, it's 2 because you need 2 to give witness. In John, it's 1 because Mary Magdalene represents the church looking for a beloved. And in Luke, it's many women because Luke likes women and they often show up in his writings. The 3 women go to the tomb early on Sunday morning. But when they say early, it means when you can see the light at the horizon, but you can't yet see the disk of the sun. They go to the tomb, and when they arrive, the stone is already rolled back. And there's a young man standing there, dressed in white, who announces that Jesus has risen. Now, it's very interesting in the Gospel of Luke, there is a young man dressed in white who appears earlier in the Gospel. When Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, there's a young man dressed in white who runs away, loses his dressing, and runs away naked. Who is this young man? This story only appears in the Gospel of Mark, and we believe that it might be Mark himself. But that young man who appears in the tomb on Easter Sunday, he's obviously an angel, but he's described as a young man dressed in white. Might that be a subtle message that even though Mark ran away on Good Friday, still Jesus gave him a chance to announce the resurrection on Easter Sunday? In fact, isn't that what happened? Mark ran away, but yet he was given permission to write this gospel. He's dressed in white. White in the Gospels is not a sign of purity, it's a sign of the resurrection. Remember at the Transfiguration, how Jesus' clothes are glowed with a whiteness. He announces to the women that Jesus has risen. And what is the response of the women? They go away and don't tell anyone anything because they're afraid. Now, that passage is in verse 8 of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16. And in verses 9 through 20 are what we call the longer ending of the Gospel. It tells us how the women announced the resurrection, how the disciples went to Galilee to meet Jesus, etc. We believe that the Gospel of Mark originally ended at verse 8, and 9 to 20 were an addition by a later scribe. Why do we believe that? Because the vocabulary, the grammar, and the theology of verses 9 to 20 are not that of Mark. They're different. You can tell that. It's kind of like a high school teacher who, correcting a term paper of a student, notices that the paper has gone from a student's words to a Wikipedia article. You can tell. Why did the scribe add those stories in verses 9 to 20? Because the original ending of the gospel was so inadequate. The women go away and they don't tell anyone because they're afraid. And so the scribe took stories from Luke, Matthew, and John, put them together to make that longer ending to the gospel. Now, why did Mark end the gospel with the women afraid and not saying anything? Well, there are 3 possible answers. The first one is that they lost the last page on the way to the printer, which I doubt. The second one is that Mark was arrested or died before he finished the gospel. And isn't that melodramatic? He's writing on a piece of papyrus, and all of a sudden you see a line of ink running down the page as they drag him away from his desk. The third reason I think is the most reasonable. He ended the gospel this way on purpose because he was writing for a community that was being persecuted, that was being martyred. When you're being thrown to the lions in the Circus Maximus in Rome, what kind of Messiah do you want to meet? I would prefer one coming on a fiery chariot who's going to open the jaws of the lion and rescue me. How often does it happen in real life? In fact, Mark is telling these people, you might be afraid, but you have to trust what you've heard. even if you haven't seen the risen Jesus yet. In fact, the women don't see the risen Jesus until the disciples see him later on. The women have to trust because of what they've been told, just as the early Christian martyrs had to trust what had been proclaimed to them, what they had been told, as they're being martyred. Again, this is a reminder to all of us that very often we don't really encounter Jesus in miraculous ways. We meet him in the everyday. We meet him in the crosses that we carry, and we have to trust. Even though sometimes we have our doubts, we're afraid. I've heard a great saying, you can wonder if you're on the right bus. Just don't get off. We all have our doubts. We all have our fears. Faith is not that we get rid of those, but that we trust in spite of them. And like those women, we encounter the risen Jesus, but very often in those difficult moments of our life. So Mark, he wants to present a gospel that is not a Cecily DeMille's production with angels singing in the background. He wants to present a gospel that's a little bit dirty and messy, just as real life is. Because it's in that moment of messiness that we hold on to Jesus for dear life, that we realize that he truly is risen, and we will rise with him. And may God bless us.